Oh, okay.
Oh, no. So Moose, years ago, I was a young lieutenant and we had this thing called transformation happening. Mm, There was this thing in the background called network centric warfare. And the way I understood it, the way I thought it was presented to me was it's all about technology and information systems and things like that. So here we are, we have Donald Rumsfeld, we have this war going on. We're going through these large transformation. They call it the transformation office. Years go by, I get into the agile space, agile coaching. And I start looking back at some of these books that were written in the late 90s about network centric warfare, planning in complex environments, and so forth. And I realized that what the military was trying to do back then isn't what we were, not the perception I had of it. It was really about building, I'm going to say it, team of teams, using mission command, network approaches, guerrilla warfare approaches applied to large organizations, if you will. Now, in the agile community, I quickly realized that that's what agile was trying to do as well, is create agility via sound principles. And then when you get into books like this here, this is called Network Centric Warfare, Developing and Leveraging Information Superiority. It's fantastic. It makes connections to John Boyd's Observer-Oriented Decide Act loop, has some other nice connections in here. And it also gives us great insights into what was going on with Admiral Cebrowski. Hopefully I said his name correctly, when he was leading up the Office of Transformation. Now, I found myself here in Norfolk, Virginia, going to this conference room in this building that had his name on it. And I'm like, that guy sounds really important. I want to look into it. So I run down to the library and I grab this book. There's a bunch of these books down there. And our guest today happens to be one of the authors, Frederick P. Stein. So Colonel Stein, welcome to the show. How you doing this morning, sir?
Thank you. Happy to join.
So glad you're here. I'd love to go back to learn a little bit more about how you became connected to Admiral Cebrowski, how you got involved with network-centric warfare, what was going on at the time, and then what was the true intent behind NCW?
Well, so I had been selected to serve on the Joint Staff at that time. I think it's still currently the case. You can't make flag officer unless you have had a stint on Joint Staff, and I was being considered for that and had not had it. And so I left my brigade and Bosnia and Rwanda period and went over and became a member of Cebrowski's staff. Cebrowski had assumed the J6 a little bit earlier than that. Colonel Roy Edwards, a buddy of mine, was a speechwriter, and I ended as plans and programs chief then on Cebrowski's staff. And NCW was just beginning. The piece that Cebrowski wrote with Edwards' help on it had really just come out, and we were just starting to talk to people like the mayor of New York and Sam Walton and others about the concept. And so we were rather in on the ground floor of it. I guess at that time, I think had one of the person in the book, had just been hired as well as a GS-14. And so John Garska and I started going around talking about network-centric warfare as we understood it, if you will.
What's the connection to Walmart? This is fascinating, and what was going on there?
Well, Cebrowski had many contacts, and one of them was the mayor of New York. The second one was Sam Walton, and he asked me to go down and interview Sam Walton and try to understand why Walmart was overtaking the traditional giants of retail, Sears and Kmart, both of which are effectively deceased. And so I had a chance to interview Mr. Walton down in his headquarters in Arkansas. Briefly, the conversation revolved around many things, but one of them was what was Walmart's significant advantage? And my exit question, I guess, was, what do you fear most from competitors? And he said, I fear most my competitors if they understand how I'm using data and how I've reorganized Walmart in order to allow subordinate layers, I would call subordinate commanders. He didn't use those terms, but people in the store, down at the store level, and even below the store manager to utilize the data. And so I thought the answer was going to be the way he was using McLean's Trucking, which is a trucking firm out of Texas that I was familiar with. And he was using those. They no longer use those. But what he was really doing is he understood, he had put his own database together. That's before people using Oracle and others significantly. And he was passing information, and he was allowing his organization to use information in a decentralized manner at just prices, if you will. They were very aware of their own blue information, their own sales, and they were relatively aware of, quote, red information, competitors' information. And so he said, those that understand that I fear, those that see me as a retail business, I don't fear at all. And so I thought that was an interesting perception. And they had changed their organizations and their command relationships significantly to take advantage of the information available. And that's when we were developing the sensor networks, the engagement networks, and the command networks, and those three, which were always conceptually what Cebrowski had in mind. And so although Secretary Rumsfeld emphasized technology, it was always about organizational and doctrinal changes simultaneously with technology changes, which rarely happen simultaneously, but that was the concept.
Well, there's so much to unpack here. I don't know which direction to go into first. I do. Cebrowski's background in the Navy. In the book, Network Centric Warfare, and I just reread this, you guys talk about the paradigm shift from F4s to F-14s, and my background's in F-14s. Cebrowski was a naval aviator. Is that correct?
That's correct. And
Okay.
I'm not an aviator, so I can't talk airplanes, but yes, he was an aviator.
So that transition, and we'll make the connection back to information and all this, is we went from high reliance on what we call ground control intercept. So we want radars on the ground to control those aircraft in the air. When you change from an F4 to an F-14, you get a bigger radar. You get the AUG-9 radar back then, which has more capability to see a bigger piece of sky, right? So that information is readily available to the pilot and REO in that aircraft. And that transition, if I understand it correctly, is Cebrowski and you saw that from the F4 to the F-14 as that information is readily available to that aircrew. So we need to go ahead and decentralize, I guess, execution and decision-making to those that are closer with the information. And I never made that connection that was also part of this thinking is this multi-sensor integration approach. Where's the information coming from and how do we push that information out to those that are closest to the front line? And I think that's what the Sam Walton story kind of brings up there as well, is I have an orientation that allows me to push information to those closest to the customer in this case. Any holes in that, Fred or Moose, in what I'm saying?
Not from my point of view. And again, I was unaware of all the connections because Cebrowski didn't necessarily talk about it that way. But conceptually, the idea of the sensor network of various sensors, and we can talk about silos of information later if you wish, breaking down the silos of information and then empowering the folks closer to the combat operations and allowing the doctrinal changes to take place that support those. So yeah, it was again, I used to draw a diagram that had those three axes of advances, if you will. And the more out of order those axes became, the less likely you were to identify and utilize the change. And I think that's the danger we have with it. So as new technology, we talk about it later, as new technology is introduced, it's even more difficult to do that. I think in this case, the radars were already there, but it was a case whether the Navy was going to allow the change, if you will, between those.
Yeah, so that shift is huge. I think we're on the 10th anniversary of the book Team of Teams coming out. And there's a connection here I want to make. It's a much celebrated book. Many business leaders look at it as like that's a paradigm shift in how we do things. When I read it, and I know some of the guys that wrote it, they just implemented what I believe to be the work that you and Cebrowski put together and others put together, network centric warfare. They had no choice, right? In order to fight a network, you got to design your organization like a network, right? So that's what is in that book. So what General McChrystal and others did, they did it out of necessity, but we also had doctrine. We had the guidance that you and Cebrowski and others came up with on how to fight this type of war. And it's not war fighting. It's just, I don't know, I'll say, unfortunately, you put network centric warfare in there. It's network centric business, sports, whatever it may be. It's a network approach. And you often talk about the if you look at wrestling teams or football teams and soccer or rugby teams or basketball, there's a difference. The game is different. Can you talk a little bit about that connection to sports so we can provide our listeners another analogy?
Yeah, so the sports analogy tends to work pretty well. And I will tell you, I don't know if John Garska came up with it, I did, or was some combination because we did a lot of talking together at the time. John had a tremendous ability to synchronize or to synthesize information. He was good at that. But so if you compare basically the playing of American football, which has violent action has assigned positions, then has a break in action, receives more information, and then conducts another violent engagement. If you compare that with soccer, which is a free-flowing game, positions are assigned, but they're not as rigid as a tight end or a defensive tackle or a center or a running back. It flows continuously. And so if you had an organization that was, quote, playing soccer, that had loose confederations of people informed by each other, but with changing roles, and you had them playing in an American team that was playing a game like American football, the gaps obviously are during the time of the huddle. Now, you can have a lot more sophisticated plays in football, American football, than you can in soccer, but you don't do it continuously. And so I would sort of discuss that those two groups represent probably the easiest transition. You can do it a bit in basketball as well if you wanted to use two American games on it. But the idea is that one requires a stoppage in action to analyze information, to pass information, and then execute it. And once again, one doesn't want to leap to the conclusion that one is superior to the other necessarily. It's depending upon time and place on things. And we can talk a little bit about organizational structure with the Apaches if you want as an example of that. But that was basically the sports examples. We use soccer and American football. Again, you could use basketball, the same analogy.
So that analogy is actually how folks in team science talk about the different types of teams. You have pooled teams like wrestlers. You have sequential teams like American football, like you just described, and you have reciprocal teams. And it's all about the degree of interdependence, what they call dynamic reallocation of resources. So in warfare, special operations and things like that, there are times when it's a high intensity, reciprocal dynamic reallocation of resources. And I'm using agents and humans and all the tech as resources. Same thing in aviation. It's that stoppage of the game, quote unquote, the game that like you pointed out, it doesn't mean you're not a team. It just means it's a different context. So this analogy you used back then is one that current IO psychologists try to help people understand what's going on in their organization. You're moving from a pulled group of people to a highly interdependent group activity, which requires you to learn how to do something that looks something like network centric warfare, pushing the information out there, mission command, connections to ONO and Shingo and all the other stuff. So that connection is fantastic. And our military saw this, but like I started off with, I thought the way it was presented to us in the early 2000s it was highly misunderstood. It was presented to us like, this is all about information systems and we got to fix these things over here. But it was never presented about human and organizational behavior. Right? Even though it's very clearly articulated in the books and the guidance, it's about human and organizational behavior. So any more, Moose, on what you heard so far?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of the things that even Boyd pointed this out is that people were focusing on tech, sensors, computers. They weren't focusing on people in the cognitive space. And I think that that's one of the things of network-centric warfare that people misunderstand, or, network-centric business, network-centric conflict, whatever you could call it, to be all encompassing. But I think that the breakdown of being in the targeting the cognitive space and creating that shared picture is so critical. That was a big takeaway from when I read it.
So I'm a little curious about, we spoke on the phone, Fred, and that you brought up something that I was not expecting, and that was a connection to Indians, and it was Apache Indians. Generally, when we talk about warfare or philosophy, we talk about Eastern philosophy, but can you help us understand what you see with how the Apaches fought and how it might connect to network-centric warfare?
Yeah. And by the way, we used warfare sort of purposely when I was on the science board for Sweden. They used network-centric defense because they didn't want to use warfare. And I haven't done much consulting outside of it, but warfare is that's the reason we used the term. So
Do
the
you have a
Apaches
catch-all,
were
Fred?
probably
Like, Fred, like if you were going to have a catch-all, like if I went into a Walmart or I went into a whatever, that I wouldn't say warfare, what would be the alternate word that you would use, not warfare?
well, I guess it's not too sexy, Mark, but I'd probably put operations.
Mm.
Network-centric operations might capture it. But so the Apaches were probably the finest light infantry, or one of the finest examples of light infantry, particularly if we focus on the way the Apaches organize themselves culturally. And culture obviously makes a difference. And so and I would argue, by the way, the introduction of technology into various cultures runs afoul for various reasons. If you were introducing culture, if you're introducing technology into an Apache organization, you would have a great deal of effort to make sure you democratized it or allowed people to speak up, because the Apache organization culture was that they shared a lot of information and they allowed people to complain and to walk away and to contribute what they wanted to contribute. And so from squad or platoon or perhaps up to company level, they exhibited tremendous flexibility in warfare, quote, violent and often quite difficult. They weren't not particularly nice warriors. I don't think warriors are particularly nice, and they weren't. But they executed tremendous ability to be flexible at certainly small unit operations because culturally, they operated in a very democratic, and I use democratic there in the traditional sense of people, individuals. Okay, I'm not making a value judgment of it. It's a description of, it's kind of when we confuse democracy with republics. They're different. So the Apaches allowed people to express opinions and to move forward. They voted on leaderships. Obviously, a person like Geronimo was the leader, but he had to be voted on constantly. And I would argue that small units can operate that way very effectively. And if they can integrate technology and doctrine, then they do so well. Now, we have to be a little careful about scale. You would unfortunately not be able to say, or fortunately or unfortunately, depending on what side you're on, the Apache's inability to operate on the operational level or the strategic level. And so you can operate at a small level this way very effectively. And so one of the challenges you've got with network-centric operations is if hierarchical organizations are going to exist, and I argue they almost always do, they almost default to that state at some stage, 50 or 100, whatever number of people. How do you continuously allow yourself to have the advantage of network-centric operations while integrating it at a higher level into hierarchical? And so the Apaches were very successful at the lower level with doing it, and we have a lot to learn from that. But if you ask whether they operated on the operational level, that's where you saw the cavalry come in with both the Comanches and the Apaches in my neck of the woods out here and defeat them. A, they had more people and more equipment, but two, they had campaign plans, which the Apaches and the Comanches had a harder time understanding. And so that's the weighting that we have to have. And again, like any continuous spectrum, you have to watch where those gap points occur so you don't stumble over them and make one comment, well, this is good and this is bad. And the answer is this value in both, which is the American football and soccer, the ability to pass that information. If you can afford to pause during an operation to correct behavior or to pass information, that's great. And we should take advantage of those. We obviously don't know much about the recent activity in Venezuela, but the final portion was very violent on the ground, very successfully executed. Had we no casualties at all, was amazing. We apparently had between 6 and 8 people injured, or 2 maybe seriously, we're not sure. But that was executed with tremendous force and vigor. Meanwhile, all the other activities went off flawlessly, or if not flawlessly, we don't know the flaws in them. And so I sort of rambled down, but the Apache example is wonderful, particularly if you study the fact that they are, I had the term here, it's a consensus versus command. There was really no single leader that had absolute command. It depended a lot upon charisma, and charisma matters. So multiple bands might loosely unite under someone like Geronimo during a crisis, but then each retained its autonomy. Can you create that? And if so, what are the challenges for mission command? And what are the challenges for passing commands? Without going into great detail, we've all seen this circle of information. You start with one and you go around it, and by the end of it, it's a totally different information. And so how do commanders ensure that their command intent has made it down? And I would argue that too requires both tremendous education and then technological passage of information. Our examples in network-centric operations in warfare in the Gulf War was the Battle of Peach Bridge, where a commander had an infantry, a cav commander had come up to a bridge. His orders were to go into a hasty defense, which is just what it sounds to your view as a defense which is not highly organized. You put out picket line, but you don't settle into an entrenched arrangement. And then another unit would pass through him. He had Blue Force tracking devices on it, which was the Army's version of network centric technology, which gave visions of where all the armored vehicles were, not infantry, but armored vehicles and helicopters, fast movers. And he could see that the unit that was going to pass through him had gotten lost. They had gone the wrong way. I said hit some enemy action, but mostly gone the wrong way. He changed his defense into a deliberate defense, which turned out to be critical because the Iraqis mounted one of the few counterattacks during the war, and he was able to repel it. And so by watching the information on blue forces, and we can talk about red if you wish, friendly forces being blue, he was able to change the concept of his defense because he knew he wasn't going to be relieved, he wasn't going to be passed through. How much of that was luck? I don't think it was luck. I think he looked at it and said, I need to change this, even though his red information in that case about the enemy had not gotten down to him in a timely manner. Different discussion.
Now, this is critical. I think one of the principles in action is shared awareness, and that pushing that information out to those that are in the fight allows them to use what John Boyd called their Fingerspitzengefühl, their fingertip feel, their intuition, along with their learned experiences and skills to make those decisions. Without that mission command approach, that cannot be done. Somebody in the background who hasn't had experience in the field for 10, 5, 7 years, whatever it may be, may make a decision on behalf of the people that are closest to that sense of feeling, that environment. So that's a huge shift. I think that organizational leaders struggle with is that isn't centralized planning. That is pushing information to those folks that actually want to make that decision on the ground. Can you talk a little bit more about the principles in action and what they mean? And more, and Moose, I want to bring this up too. When people talk about the OODA loop, they talk about speed, and our pushback on that is, if you have a horrible orientation, I don't care how fast your OODA loop is. It's really about, you can call it speed of command or speed of orientation or quality of orientation. But can you talk a little about those principles in action, that shared awareness, and what you mean by speed?
So, yeah, I think there's a couple of terms we use that were probably not adequately described. The one that was the most difficult to describe was self-synchronization. I'll get back to the others in a moment. So self-synchronization has its birth in mathematical theory, and we should have been clearer about that. The ability to allow units to self-synchronize with each other because they are aware of each other's positions and activities is critical in order to increase speed of command. And speed of command, at least the way we talked about it, was getting inside the opponent's OODA loop, getting inside the orient, decide, enact loop. And so if you were able to self-synchronize, and again, that's where the soccer American football analogy plays out, you were able to do that. That required a higher degree of awareness. And we could talk about situational awareness. I never talk about situational dominance. If you're going to use the terms, then a military person would probably be better off using air superiority or air dominance. Did we have air dominance or air superiority when we crossed the D-Day invasion? That was probably air dominance. I think there were two Focke-Wulfs or Messerschmitts seen the whole day. We effectively cleared the skies of German aircraft. But that was a very, very short period of time for that to happen. And so I think you achieve situational awareness over time. You may achieve situational dominance on a brief period of time, but the enemy has a vote in it. And so the awareness by the commanders of where you are in that phase is vital. Are you really dominant? Are you aware? Is each side aware? If you take a look at the conflict in Ukraine today, we're seeing high levels of situational awareness in a World War I kind of environment, which is certainly interesting. You could argue that the introduction, if you really wanted to go back, you could argue the introduction of snipers during World War I by the Germans and then followed about a year later by the British. French never really got it right, allowed visibility over no man's land in a way that we never saw before because we had eyes on. Now, aircraft were pretty small back then, but you had snipers who were observing no man's land on almost a constant basis. They could see a change in fortifications almost instantly. So situational awareness. The problem was, of course, the snipers' information never passed back to anything more than the immediate group of people. And so self-synchronization, then, I think what Cebrowski talked about, it was in the aviation area, but can you achieve self-synchronization with a larger organization if you can pass the commander's intent, if it's understood, and you have disciplined people to act within it, while still allowing them the authority to move outside of it? And we can talk about authority and responsibility and command climate if you wish. Did that answer it? That was pretty vague.
No, it did. It did answer that. And one thing that we actually run a simulation on Mission Command where we show what we'll call it self-organization or self-synchronicity, how that works when the commanders on the ground, in this case, those that are closest to the customer, know what's happening over here and over around there. They start coordinating, organizing in ways that a centralized approach can't do, right? So we actually demonstrate that to folks, and it's a very powerful tool that we borrowed from the military, actually, to help people understand that. So teaching this type of thinking through experiential learning activities is huge. And this is something I think that Cebrowski learned we all learned, by the way, because the way we train in the military, right? In naval aviation, with our Top Gun approach, it's a leadership apprenticeship program where we learn mission command through apprenticeship models, right? We learn how to brief, plan, and all that other good stuff, and understand the technology. You get out there and you run a mission command or mission commander scenario, and you also run a strike leader scenario. And we talked about that recently with Ed Breniger on another episode about what that's like. But the point behind this is, in order to actually know how to do these things, you have to experience them. And I think that's what the military did for us is we had to do this out of necessity. And going back to World War I and the sniper story you just shared, that sniper was unable, just because of the technology didn't exist, to share that information with somebody 200 miles away, 50 miles away, 20 miles away. Today, that's available. And it also works in reverse. That turns into that 1,000-mile screwdriver where we can use incidents, activities in the last 72 hours. People think they know what happened or what's happening on the ground, even though they're not there. So that 1,000-mile screwdriver that we saw in Air and Space Operations Centers, because we could see from the predator feed, what they called predator porn. I don't know if you remember that, but the JFACs, they would Joint Force Air Component Commanders would lean heavily and say, "Why aren't they doing this? Why aren't they doing that?" Well, that's not the job of the person in the background. It's not to get the tactical shorts of those on the ground. It's just to guide the bigger picture. And I think that's where it's very hard for leaders to do this, because they're like, well, look, I'm seeing what they're seeing. Clearly, they don't know what they're doing. That may not be true. So, Fred, this discussion on network centric warfare and your connection to Cebrowski, and you left the military. Can you tell us what it was like going into leadership and management consulting with this knowledge and some of the, I guess, successes and failures you had in working with leaders?
Before we shift to that, I just had a couple of questions for Fred. Take the U.S. out and move past World War I. Like, as you were talking and unpacking a lot of those things, it made me think of the IDF and the 6-day war. And I was wondering, I know that Don Starry and William Depew they were studying the Yom Kippur War, and they sent people over to do that. I know that John Boyd did as well, that he mentioned Yom Kippur War. And I've had the IDF on my brain lately because a guest that we're recording with later is a Medal of Valor recipient from the Yom Kippur War. But when I think in context of the IDF, and I think of the study I've done on the 6-day war and other things, that sort of network centric approach of where the information is flowing back and forth. Did you ever look at anything with the IDF? It's because it seems to me like they're pretty good at this historically, from a maneuver standpoint, from a strategic, operational, and tactical being connected.
Yeah, I did to some extent, and it's interesting. Certainly, the Israelis have been very successful at integrating and the 6-day war. I think the interesting one would be both the successful integration and the non-successful integration. So the Israelis have been very successful and were successful in Golan Heights and some of the near-run things that they had with the Six-Day War. On the other hand, the ability of the Israelis to differentiate vital information and necessarily pass it has had some significant gaps, as has everybody's, not just the Israelis, to be sure. And so I think what we have to learn from that is if you have blue force awareness and you have a degree of red force awareness, how do information systems assist humans, or how do humans inform information systems of when gaps of information take place? To wit, red information should have, in my opinion, some sort of timestamp on it that says this bogey has been identified at this time, or in the Israelis' cases, this fence line has been identified at this time. And so if you have near continuous information, then you have a tough time understanding when that information is valid or how old it is. And so you need a timestamp on it. And by the way, you need that for industry too. When Walton was talking about price changes, he made it very clear that his people understood when the price changes took place in, quote, competitive environment, and how much authority they had to make corresponding price changes to compete with them. And so both militaries, the U.S. and the Israelis, have some trouble understanding the difference between accuracy of blue information, which should be better, and accuracy of red information, which is rarely as good, and the timestamp on each. And I don't know how you do timestamping very well. We tended to use faded icons. It wasn't great, but that's what the U.S. Army does with FBCV2, Force 21 Brigade and below, or Blue Force Tracker. And I haven't been able to break the code on the Ukraine situation to know how good they are or how good the Russians are of understanding the information by a nearly transparent battlefield that we're seeing there. The Six-Day War is a good example of synchronization of forces, to be sure. On the other hand, one looks at why did the air defense capabilities of the enemy were so badly underestimated earlier as well, and they missed that completely. And so how do you understand what you missed, or how did you understand what went wrong with the surveillance systems during the October tragedy?
Versus Yom Kippur War, like the difference
Versus
between
Yom
Six
Kippur.
Day and the
So
Yom
what went
Kippur War.
Yeah, what went wrong with those situations, I think, are useful to study as well. An example, for instance, I had a chance to brief, of all odd things, the Enron staff on network centric operations.
No way.
I met the vice president on a travel, and they asked me to come down. And so I spent an afternoon with Enron, and I talked about network centric operations, and they compared it to the traders on the floor. And then we went around, and I said, well, do you think there is something to be utilized by Enron in this case? And they said, no, they didn't think so. And I said, why? And they said, because the way we reward traders was based upon their individual performance within Enron. And I thought back to my days at Georgia Tech, both as an engineer and as a business student, and I almost said, I did not say, well, you're a public company and you're obligated to act for your shareholders. And this approach seems to be acting in behalf of the traders, not the shareholders. Of course, I wasn't smart enough to short Enron, but they had the information, but they didn't share it because the organizational structure and reward structure said, don't share information because we want the internal competition to occur.
Yeah. I spent a long time in asset management, and hoarding information and not sharing is common because you don't want to have another portfolio manager beat your performance, and you don't want to look dumb in front of some other guy. It's pretty bad. So I spent my last 7 years at a firm, a very well known firm, trying to preach that, like, that information sharing across networks was actually more powerful. That created a harmonized orientation picture. And people thought I was absolutely effing crazy. Like, they thought that's the craziest shit in the world, because we're so proprietary down to each level of teams that nobody has any idea what the other's doing. So what ends up happening is you don't, because people would end up saying, well, we didn't think you needed to know that, but you have no idea to know what I need to know and what I don't need to know because you weren't sharing it anyway. And you have no idea of my perspective of how I'm trying to fight the mission or whatever. And there's so much squandered opportunity. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, and that was exactly what and you have much better experience than I do on it, but that was the Enron experience, their reward
Oof.
structure. And I found that at MITRE, who I went with after the military, and it's a wonderful organization. But even there was a sense of how can you, I've never been able to break this code, but if you did a network map of people in an organization, and I find Linked is one of the old books that I thought was best about this. How do you identify the super connectors in your organization? And how do you reward super connectors? They may not actually do anything other than connect people.
Mm.
And how do you reward the number of connections they make, if you will? We know that some nodes are more important than others. Networks are not a democracy. It's a power law situation. And so how do you reward those people adequately in order to, or at least recognize, if not reward them? And as again, Enrod, and obviously your example is more valid than the Enron one, but the whole system argued against that. And
Can we
knowledge is
contrast?
power.
Can we contrast the Israeli example? Because like when you look at like just use I don't know, say 6-Day War or whatever, the whole entire operational picture and the selfless approach to making sure that everybody is successful within that is owned by everybody from the top all the way to the bottom and everything in between. In a standard structure in a Wall Street firm or a trading firm or an Enron, it's the opposite. It's like shareholder value is prime and we're going to be doing this and we're going to be making money, but everybody's kind of every man for himself in isolated silos. And that's what I observed when I was in that world, saying there's so much being left on the table because the free flow of information, kind of like how McChrystal would describe in the team of teams as the operations and intelligence brief, that all of the sudden, the more people that they involved in that and the more information was flowing, the more knowledge was created and the more understanding was created. And they were finding things from, I think one of his examples was all of a sudden an airman and Diego Garcia came up with an idea that was effective in Iraq for I don't know, something to do with when they would catch prisoners or whatever. But had that person not been involved, they never would have found it out. They never would have got the information.
Yeah, I think, again, I think that's where organizational structure, and I'm going to give one other example, but that's where organizational structure and the corresponding rewards, obviously people are motivated by money in many cases, not all cases, but in many cases.
Well, now on
And
Wall
so
Street,
that you've
for
got
sure.
to have an organizational reward structure that rewards that. I've forgotten the gentleman's name and I apologize. I thought I had it here, but I didn't. In the early phases of Afghanistan, an acquaintance of mine, a pretty good acquaintance of mine, was running one of the fleet, the early aircraft carriers that arrived over there. And he had been raised under Cebrowski. He had worked with us in the offices, actually at N6 before the Office of Force Transformation. And he put up a wall of knowledge, which at that time was certainly not as complete as they are today. But he allowed everybody to put information in. And I recall being back at the Pentagon, and there was much consternation that he would allow junior members to put in data onto the wall. And he said, you're going to get about a bunch of bad information that way. It will not have been vetted properly. We won't have we won't have all the information, the details about the information. He said, no, I think it's more important. The speed of information is more important. And by the way, I think it'll kind of work like a Wikimedia. It will self-correct. Somebody will put in information that's incorrect, and somebody will say, wait a second, that's not right. And it'll actually be corrected fairly quickly. He was very successful with that. The subsequent commander came in and he dismantled the organization completely. He was very uncomfortable with organization flowing at all sorts of levels, particularly by people who were not, quote, intel analysts or analysts that should have been putting out this information. And again, it is both ways. If you don't have a Wikimedia sort of protection that says, okay, wait a second, we have somebody out here trying to put in bad information, needs to be corrected. On the other hand, you've got to be able to allow people to put in information. That's a flattening of the input chain that's vital to networked organizations. And once
So
again, you've got to understand both sides.
if I heard you right, you're saying that the naval aviator was trying to create an environment where there was more participation at every level, junior, middle management, senior, everything. And the submariner was more of a hierarchical thing, like a more of a
No, I don't know that. I just know that the subsequent commander came in and changed it. I have no idea what their backgrounds were.
so
I
so
suspect they were both aviators.
okay. Well, like, it's kinda like Ponch, what we were speaking about with Ed Brenegar yesterday about how in the naval aviation community, like an '06 taking insight from an '03 is not uncommon. It's certainly not uncommon in the Marine Corps, what I was in. I mean,
Yeah.
because
No,
the sub
I so as both of you are having that conversation, just hit me that, and this is the truth. When we created the flow system, and I'll share something with you in a moment, it's really the evolution of network centric warfare. And I can now say this in the age of artificial intelligence, right? So there are some things that were written in the 90s and early 2000s about network centric warfare that John Boyd may not agree with synchronicity versus harmonization versus self organization, things like that. That's fine. That's called evolution, right? We learn from these things. Um, and I'm going to share something with you right now, Fred. And I don't think I talked about this. This is the flow guide. This is just it's available online for those listeners, and I'll put this in there. But as you were talking about leadership here in the last few minutes, it clicked to me that boundary spanners, and I'll read this out to everybody, operate in the boundaries between teams and between teams and multi-team systems. Their roles and responsibilities include providing resources, fostering interactions, coordination of activities, and an alignment of goals, to name only a few. Now, this is, I'm going to give correct attribution to John Turner now at Texas A&M. This is his world of expertise, understanding complex adaptive systems and that distributed leadership. So just for clarity, what I'm saying here is the flow system is the evolution of network-centric warfare. It really encompasses John Boyd's real OODA loop. And if Mark and I were to rewrite this today, I would say the things that we learned in the podcast and over the last 4 or 5 years highlight that the OODA loop is one of the things that represents the flow system. And the key currency is information from the external world. And by the way, the key component or a key component inside of the orientation, not a phase, inside orientation, the world model is new information, right? It's right there in the OODA loop. I want to go back to something, and I think Moose might be interested in this as well. The term Boyd used harmonize, and Moose, I want to turn this over to you to kind of say it more eloquently. What, the problem Boyd had with synchronization in the Army. Can you talk a little bit about that, Moose?
Yeah,
and your view?
and Fred, for context, I was a Marine officer, and I'm a devoted scholar of advancing and developing Boyd's ideas, which, as you know, were extremely influential in the Marine Corps in our warfighting doctrine. And I'm also the son of a career West Pointer who was on the chief of staff of the Army staff at the time of this battle was going on between Boyd and Tradoc. And Boyd had been brought out to SAMS at Fort Leavenworth. And for our listeners that may have remembered from other conversations, that's the School of Advanced Military Studies. And Ubavasta Seg was bringing Boyd into Leavenworth to basically teach patterns of conflict and other things that you've cited in network-centric warfare. And the one thing, and I forget what it was, and it was coming through airland battle, and earlier I'd mentioned Depew and Starry. The clash came when Boyd was adamant about the elimination of the word synchronization in favor of harmonize. And harmonize had been, an Eastern concept. It had been used in Blitzkrieg and that sort of thing. And when you go through the boxes in the archives like we have, and if I recall, I'm pretty sure it's box 14, and I've gone through this and I'm reading these things, and likely my father wrote some of this stuff, and because he was there for this, and I'm reading these things because my dad was he was a mech infantry guy, but his secondary was PAO, and that was his job on the chief's staff. And I'm reading these things, and I think General Foss was the Tradoc commander at the time, and General Sullivan, who my father worked for, that he was the chief of staff of the Army, and they were adamantly fighting about the word synchronize. There's no way we're ever going to use the word harmonize from what I gathered from the readings, and there was a scientist that was at high up at TRADOC that was an advisor to the TRADOC CG, and I can't think of what his name was, but he was an ally of Boyd. And they were basically saying, like, it seemed to me, my impression was harmonized sounds effeminate, so we're not using that. We're using synchronized because that sounds like hardcore, good old fashioned army talk. But Boyd thought it was disastrous for one reason. He thought it was disastrous because when you use synchronize in terms of human cognition, you're treating a human as if they're not a human. You're treating them as a machine. You can synchronize a watch, but you can't synchronize a human. You can harmonize humans, and humans are the ones that actually fight wars, not machines. That was a scuff that they had, and it's pretty well documented in almost a full box in the archives. I've gone through a few times.
Mhm.
I think also you'd write a book about it, because from what I've gathered is that air-land battle, it did adopt a lot of what Boyd had been saying, but Boyd didn't get he didn't get the acknowledgement, and the reason was the battle over the word synchronization and harmonize.
Yeah, I can't recall that coming up. It certainly is an interesting discussion. And I guess I'd give I'm not sure it fills in, but perhaps you had asked an earlier question about command climate, and it might be worth
Mhm.
speaking about that briefly.
Yeah.
My little story on command climate is a pretty simple one. If you're an officer in charge and you've brought a staff meeting together and you're discussing a problem, and at the end of the staff meeting, you turn and you as the senior have felt that there perhaps wasn't enough discussion, and you say either one of four elements are taking place. I'm either the smartest person in this room and everybody agrees with me. I hope that's not the case, and I don't think it's the case. All of you are insufficient staff officers, haven't done your job, and you're not prepared to talk. That's kind of depressing. Or I have had a command climate in which you don't feel your contributions are going to be recognized and or rewarded. And I guess you could say that either way. And therefore, it isn't worth your time to express those. The last is symbolic of a command climate that is not going to allow decision making to be cooperative regardless of information availability. And so the command climate that says, I'm willing to listen, I'm actually willing to listen. I may not agree, and you may have to carry out the order or go with the plan that you don't agree with, but you have been heard and your feelings have been appreciated. Now, whether that gets back to harmonizing or synchronization is an interesting question because it's kind of a soft term, but that would
Well,
be my
that was the
example.
battle. That was the battle, and what he said, what Boyd said in patterns of conflict, the definition of harmony was this is slide 166: the power to perceive or create interaction of apparently disconnected events or entities in a connected way. And he thought that insight, initiative, adaptability, and harmony were the requirements. Those were the ingredients of having that unified vision. That if everybody had that unified vision, then that was how they would. That's how they would be successful in an operation. And another kind of anecdote: Boyd was a massive devotee of the movie Patton, and Patton has a great depiction of how he's got, and Coram says this in the Boyd biography, the Germans were even baffled that the Americans stopped and slowed down when Patton had the spear right at their heart and he's ready to march into Berlin. And they showed in the movie where Bradley's like, George, I got to slow you down. We don't really understand what you're doing. You've had a lot of success, but we've got to slow you down and let everybody else catch up. And what ended up happening is that per Boyd, and it's also in the bio, that like another, the war went on for X amount of months and another X amount of guys got killed on both sides that were unnecessary because the Germans were ready to throw it up when Patton punched out. And that was another one of the sort of historical references that were coming back to that discussion of harmony versus synchronization. Like the synchronization requirement would suggest, hey, George, stop Third Army and let everybody else catch up. We have to synchronize, versus harmonize, understand what I'm doing. Let's get this over with fast. We've attacked the cognitive understanding of the war in the German sense is being shattered right now, and they're ready to throw in the towel. We can get Germany faster. We don't have to wait for the Soviets. We got it, and that whole thing just kind of dissipated. I think that was some of the historical context that was used in that.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think probably worth further discussion. I agree partially. I would probably push back historically. We can get into it later, but I don't think the German leadership was going to surrender with it. And so I guess I would not have preferred to waste lives going into Berlin, but that's a different discussion on it.
Well, how about a more recent example then? Wasn't that an issue with Schwarzkopf and Fred Franks in Desert Storm with 7th Corps? Like, he was waiting to synchronize, and Schwarzkopf was demanding get in there and hook, which, by the way, Boyd was helpful with that, with Schwarzkopf and Cheney, helping to devise the left hook. But wasn't that one of the issues where there was some internal conflict on that?
Yeah, I think so, and I think that's probably a better example than the Berlin one, which can be argued by a number of sides. And whether they can get it, whether unconditional surrender was a good idea. There are lots of questions in that one. You have to be a little careful not to extrapolate network-centric operations with the understanding of people's desires internally, which we can't generally see, and when it's depressing. But one should never underestimate the ability of strong men and women to either terrorize or conform a population, which is why mass bombings generally don't break the spirit of people. It didn't break the spirit of Warsaw in the 40,000 people were killed in Warsaw and hardly got any publicity at all. Hundreds of thousands died, of course, in Dresden or in Japan. None of those effectively broke the spirit of either the countries. We can go on about Japan and Germany.
Have you read Bomber Mafia, by the way, by Malcolm Gladwell? Because he does a really good.
I haven't read that one,
but he says what you just said, that the technical bombing doesn't do anything to break the spirit. Had the opposite effect.
That's right. It certainly did. What I did do, I don't know if you've ever gone to the Bomber Museum, but those of us who returned from Vietnam were not particularly appreciated by some of the American public. Not all, but some of the American public. I did not understand that the same phenomena took place for the British bomber crews after the war. And the British Bombing Museum was the last major museum in England to be established. By the way, I also did not understand the same phenomena for German fighter pilots were not appreciated because they were seen as having failed to stop the bombers. A higher calling has been a book I read recently on that. I think we have to appreciate that as interesting and useful as network-centric operations and the harmonization or synchronization, there are other elements that come to play.
Well, you were going to go back to the Schwarzkopf and Franks example from.
Yeah. I think in that case, that one is a good example of commander's intent not being agreed upon. And there we have the situation of hierarchical versus non-hierarchical. You could argue that Schwarzkopf did not understand what was happening on the ground, and Franks did. And Franks said, no, I've got to move at this rate. These are the supply lines. This is my artillery positioning. These are the number of weapons I have. There are all sorts of things that Franks was looking at. Did Schwarzkopf have the same information? I don't know, but did Franks understand that he could have, that because of the technological advantages of the M1A1, it wasn't SEP at the time, but the M1A1 and Blue Force tracking, that the Iraqi networks were in fact broken and broken fairly quickly. So I think that is a classic study that ought to be looked at. It's hard for me to know, because I wasn't on the ground, what the whether the commander's intent by Schwarzkopf was adequately expressed or not. I worked a lot with Schwarzkopf's aide, who went on to be a 2-star when he was in Rwanda with me. And so I got a lot of insight from Schwarzkopf from him. But that's an interesting question on it, is how quick. And I don't know what Franks was getting from his subordinate commanders either. And so was the subordinate commander saying, no, I'm not comfortable moving that quickly. And here's why. And so we have to be, I think, cognizant of that. But it does appear to me that the commander's intent wasn't being carried out, and retrospectively could have been. Then finally, how much of the road of death did we want to carry out? How much how much violence can you sell to a particular populace? I think the more dead enemy, the better. And Patton had it right, but that's hard to sell to a populace. So yeah, I think you have to. Yeah, I think you have to be at least cognizant of the whole picture with it.
I want to switch up a little bit and kind of bring this home with you. I want to talk about the current type of warfare. We have AI starting to, well, it's been around just for a little bit. It's going to start accelerating here. We have this cognitive warfare, psychological warfare, information warfare. How does the elements that you have in network centric warfare or operations fit into this new realm of warfare, if you want to call it a new realm of warfare? And then maybe take us back through some of the highlights and lessons learned, regrets that you have for what you learned in the military and so forth. So let's start with the bringing network centric warfare to what it is today, what it means in this disruptive landscape of liminal warfare.
Yeah, so I think a couple of things. I think the silos of information that have existed, and continue to exist, predominantly driven by security and speed. So the example on that one is ballistic missile defense people don't want to share information because they feel that their mission doesn't allow it. They don't have time. They need to engage suborbital. My feeling is engage your target, but share the information. And so there's silos of information that are either brought up because of speed necessary to execute or because of security, predominantly because of security. So if we
can I
don't,
build on that for a second? So
sure.
so I do my background in fighter aviation and air and space operations. I went into ballistic missile defense, air and missile defense. I went through all the training, went through Aegis BMD training over here in Dahlgren. So this is right before we created the AADC in Europe and all that, defense of Israel. So you're spot on. So an aviator coming into that world, I pointed out several things where people are like, "What do you mean you could?" I can't get into a lot of details here, but you're taking a non-expert, bringing them into this world, and saying, "Hey, you can't operate like this. You can't shoot missiles around aviators and just go, well, they're." I don't want to give away too much information. If I'm flying aircraft and one of my blue ships shoots a missile through me, I'm going to be pissed off at them, right? And to them, that's like, well, that's okay. And we're like, no. It's no difference in Moose aiming a gun at me, trying to shoot somebody behind me, right? It's the same thing. I'm like, I don't want that. It may work out in some instances, but yes, that information sharing is absolutely critical and was restricted. And I don't know where it is right now. This is many years ago when I was on that BMD side. So thanks for sharing that. You're spot on.
Yeah, so I think if we move from that to, and I'm engaged intellectually looking at it, but I certainly don't understand it. So if we move to machine learning, and I prefer that term over artificial intelligence, but if we move to machine learning and artificial intelligence today, and we take a look at the impact on some weapon systems, it's dramatic. Obviously, we can have target acquisition of unmanned weapons without centralized control based upon the appearance, the heat signature or the physical signature, and the AI can engage the target. And we're seeing that in Ukraine today. And we may have seen it in Venezuela, I don't know. At the same time, all of us would be interested in having the quote, little person sitting on your shoulder during the engagement saying, this is the information I have. What do you think? And the AI agent says, well, gosh, captain, lieutenant, sergeant, whatever, have you thought about these things? That would be useful, I think. The passage of getting beyond data to information to knowledge, and then to wisdom. And at 77, that's about all that's left of that. And so wisdom it brings in the experience. And so there's great advantages potentially to it. The disadvantages obviously are that it takes an increasing degree of information to sort out when something's wrong. My experience with that one, and I won't get too political, but I do senior university classes, and I did one on information disinformation. Then I did one on 12 decisive battles, and now I'm doing on partnerships that have changed the world. And one of the questions was, how many American Cincinnatus are there? And I'm sure your audience may or may not remember, but Cincinnatus was a Roman senator who was offered the chance to retain power, and he left and went back to his ranch or his farm or whatever they had.
That was Washington's model, right? That was
yeah, and that was going to be the example. So I asked
Yeah.
AI for examples of American Cincinnatus, and I expected exactly, Moose, that it would be George Washington. It came up with George Washington. It also came up with a recent president who chose not to run for a second term. I objected to that and said, gosh, is that really an example of an American Cincinnatus? And the AI system came back and said, gee, I guess you're right. It isn't.
Wait,
Because I
hold on.
challenged
An
the AI
American,
system.
hold on, an American president that chose not to run for a second term. Hold on.
Yeah, I won't go any further, but we could probably guess who that might be. Calling that person an American Cincinnatus would be a reach, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I can't think of, I mean, in modern history, I'm having a stressful time thinking of what president didn't run for a second term. I can think of presidents that lost, like, that didn't run for a second term.
Moose, there's only one in our basic lifetime here.
Just happened,
dude.
But he ran. Oh, sorry. But he ran for a second term, though. But he got. Yeah. Okay. Gotcha. Okay. Sorry. I'm thinking
we'll get the crayons out for you, Moose.
I'm thinking James Polk. Or I'm a history teaching major, Fred. I apologize. Yeah, sorry.
I got too recent with you, but anyway, his name came up, and I objected, saying that I didn't think that constituted the famous farewell address that Washington.
Yeah, I think most people would agree with that.
Helped wrote.
I think most people would agree on either side of the spectrum with that. Yeah.
Yeah. But anyway, I'm always kind of worried about it. And to be honest, I instruct, and I do senior university, I instruct people on using AI, and I'm going to be thinking of writing a second book about my leadership experiences, and I'll probably dictate into a computer, and I'll probably have AI correct it and organize it, and then I'll look through it, and I think it'll be much easier. But I wish I had more information on the use of intelligence and the way it's being done in the Ukraine. I find that fascinating, but I'm not able to get very much of that one. But we're seeing, I think, some of that happening with the SEAL teams and the tracing of the maritime vessels we've got going on now. I think that's fascinating. And of course, the Venezuela operation, which we don't know much about really, but the synchronization of the air assets was extraordinary, and the ground assets and the helicopter assets, as well as the undercover assets. That didn't make the Bin Laden affair look easy, but relatively speaking, it was a much less complicated issue by if we take kind of three examples. If we take the aborted rescue in Iran, if we take the Bin Laden execution, and then we take the recent Venezuela one, those would be interesting case studies to run as far as self-synchronization, speed of command, and networks. I've never seen that done, but it would be interesting.
You mentioned
so Fred,
when you talked about shipping, like you're talking about Ukraine and the intelligence picture, one thing that always shocks me is what's actually available open source. One of the apps that I have is called Marine Traffic. And when I live in Manhattan, and when you're standing in the harbor, and I've done this in Charleston, I've done this in Savannah, and you hold your phone up and you look out to a ship, it'll tell you the flag, it'll tell you the registry of where it came from, where it's going. You can do the same thing. There's another one called Flight Radar 24, and it's the same thing. You can look up at a plane, it'll tell you what it is. You can even know when the doomsday plane is moving, when it's flying out off it. I get an alert and it's on there. So I think that there's a lot. We had somebody come on one time that's saying that a lot of intelligence is actually right in our front of our faces. It's just not in a vault. It's people just can't piece together what they see. But try the Marine Traffic app. It's mind blowing. But I wanted to ask you, Fred, and I wanted to ask this at the outset from my perspective, but you do a really good job of breaking up the three domains, the cognitive, the information, and the physical. And it's not enough to have, in this day and age with things like AI and everything, it's not, you have to have all three. The physical is not enough. And I found in business that most people are concerned about physical capital metrics. They're not thinking that the battle's actually in the cognitive domain, where the decisions are made, where the perception lives. And I find that even in some of our advisory engagements now, I'm always trying to make the case that if we're going to wage war, you have to start in the cognitive domain. And everything has to support that, going back to Boyd's people, ideas, things, or the fact that people fight wars and they use their minds, not machines. Can you just comment on the 3 levels and how you break those down in the book? Because I think it's important for if a business leader that we're advising is going to take our advice around this concept, and we recommend your book, I'd really want them to zone in the understanding of those 3 things, and that they have to win their respective battles in that cognitive domain. It's so critical. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The ability to understand and appreciate that and I'm not a biologist, but the synapsal relationships in the brain are not the same as the digital relationships in a computer. And they're fundamentally different. They're not right or wrong, they're different. And that's what allows, I think, as I understand it, innovation to occur and ideas to move pseudo-randomly, if you will. I'm sure they're not random, but pseudo-randomly across the synapses in the brain. And so the cognitive function it has to be understood and allowed to prosper with it, as well as the other areas. I'm challenged when I think about, and it's going to be slower, I think, than people appreciate, maybe not. But as we move to quantum computing and we add AI onto it, then I find it more fascinating of whether or not quantum computing is more akin to the cognitive functions than digital computing. And I don't know. I don't know enough about the spin of the electrons and how quantums and qubits work in detail. But the ability of the commander's intent to be clearly stated and therefore shared cognitive perceptions and values, if you will, if you wanted to get into values, I think is key within the organization. If you're going to utilize sensors and information flows, if you're going to try to de-emphasize hierarchical levels, and there'll always be some of those, then the sharing of the intent, if you will, the cognitive intent, I think is key. And I think that takes more time, and I'm sure you guys have done a lot more study of how to actually game it and train people in it. But that's an area which I think probably needs a great deal more work on it.
Yeah, well, thanks for that. I mean, like I said, that's for the network centric business, the network centric operations that, when we're advising people, I mean, that's the big takeaway I'd want them to have is to understand the 3 domains and the paramount nature of the cognitive domain. So thanks for that.
So Fred, just kind of curious if we can wrap this up here. I know you have a meeting coming up here in a little bit, but can you tell our listeners what you're doing and maybe share some pieces of wisdom from your career and what you've been doing since you retired?
Well, I'm not sure there are a lot of wisdom, but I would pass along to people, you guys are much younger, but when you reach your first of several retirements, and I would argue this probably a series of retirements. I retired from the military and went to work for MITRE, which turned out to be a great move. And then I retired from MITRE. If you retire totally, I think you tend to die pretty early. And so I think when you retire, you've got to understand that you've got to keep healthy activities, whether it's golf or pickleball or running or whatever you want to do. And then you've got to combine it with mental activities. In my case, I took up golf pretty seriously, hated it for a while, couldn't play it, got reasonably good at it. I'm about a 12 handicap, mostly honest. And then you got foot wedges and things like that. That a 12-foot putt is almost close enough to call it.
Yeah.
And then I think you have to stay mentally active. I do it by teaching at senior university. And I forced myself to actually put together classes. I was always interested in battles, so I put together 12 decisive battles. Obviously, they're more than that. And now I'm doing 12 partnerships that have changed the world. And I got to be honest, I'm struggling to get those. The first 2, interesting enough, the relationship between Socrates and Plato, and then the relationship between Plato and Aristotle.
How about Aristotle and Alexander the Great?
Actually, I included that one in there because I thought it was so cool that I said I have 3 philosophers, and then we have one of the greatest generals in the world. So I actually did. It's a very good, very, very poignant point.
See, I told you I was a history major. It wasn't recent, so I could get that one.
And we don't want to be too recent. And then I moved to comparing Augusta and Agrippa's relationship and Genghis Khan and Subutu's relationships.
So this is like John Boyd. These are all like John Boyd things that he would really love.
So that's I would suggest to people as they move through the period of life. Health obviously is problematic, but you can work at it. You can keep yourself healthy. You can try to work at it. Sometimes shit happens and it just
Is
goes
any of your
bad.
work publicly
But I would
available?
say
Your things on decisive battles or partnerships? We'd love to look at it.
it's interesting. Lifelong learners of Georgetown had them up for a while. I do allow them all to be recorded, so they existed. I think they take them down, which I wish they wouldn't. I didn't care. There's no money involved in it. I just do it for free, of course. In fact, I'm vice president of it, which is why they go to the strategic planning meeting, which we'll see how that goes. We'll fund a strategic planning in some cases. We'll see how it goes. Yeah, I have all those if anybody's ever interested in it. The 12 decisive battles start off in Egypt, in ancient Egypt, and go all the way forward to include the Six-Day War. And then the partnerships, I'm going to have 12 of them. I'm completing Hamilton and Washington part 1 and part 2 now. And then I don't know whether they're going to do Abigail Adams and John Adams as part 1 and 2 or not. I am going to do, I will suggest a book that if people want to read about an interesting partnership, I'll leave it at this one. There's a book called The Partnership, how original, that does Stimson and Marshall. And I found it
That's
fascinating.
interesting.
I knew a lot more about Marshall than I did about Stimson.
Speaking of Wall Street guys, and he was a Secretary of War in 2 different administrations.
2 different administrations. It's
Yeah.
very powerful, very interesting individual. And if you study the partnership prior to the American entry into World War II, and then the partnership during the Secretary of War and Marshall as the Chief of Staff, fascinating partnership and the way they worked off of each other. People know Marshall much better, obviously the Marshall clan, but I don't know.
Is Grant and Sherman too cliche?
That's what I think it is.
Is Grant and Sherman too cliche, or Lee and Jackson?
You could do that one. I think Lee and Jackson might be more. Both of those are very interesting ones because I'll leave it with this one. I at War College, I had the chance to work with Jay Luvos, who's passed now. Jay Luvos is a wonderful historian and took us on battle walks. And you could walk Civil War battlefields from the tactical all the way to the strategic. And I remember I was interested in whether or not the operational level of war existed, or whether it was just an American interpretation of the Soviet concepts and didn't really exist at all. And I remember Jay Lua standing at the edge of the wilderness area and pointing out that Lee was already planning his next series of campaigns, or I guess it was Antietam, planning the next series of campaigns. So there was the operational level of war does and can exist separate from tactical and the strategic level. And so, and I used to do a lot of walks, battlefield walks of Gettysburg and Antietam in particular, and the wilderness to some extent.
We've
Anyway,
done that as well to take leaders to Gettysburg, which has been great. But no, I'd love to look at those. So send those over. I'd love to see those. Those would be cool.
I have all those. I'll give you one last story at Gettysburg. I ran a tour with a Soviet set of officers back when the Soviet Union existed.
Wow.
And we went through Gettysburg, and I said, this is a good place to stop and use the restroom because there aren't any ones further along the battlefield. And the Russian general said, we don't need to do that. And I could sort of see the colonels thinking, no, we really do need to do that. So I took a pee and nobody else did and watched them suffer. I thought it was sort of a strange phenomenon.
How Soviet? How higher?
Yeah.
It might be worth at least a little vignette, like a little book, about taking Soviet generals to Gettysburg. That's really cool.
Fred, hey, we really appreciate your time. This has been a treat because, like I said, we've been studying network centric warfare for a while, looking at it. It really influenced my thinking inside the flow system anyway. And of course, when you make the connection between, or anyone makes a connection between like team of teams or anything of good command, mission command, anything like that, I think you have to pick up the book Network Centric Warfare. And I just want to call out to you. I don't know if you know, I'm going to get his name correct here. Steve, let me get his name for you. He's Hertzberg, Stephen Hertzberg.
Yeah.
So what's your relationship with him? And by the way, thank you, Steve, for the recommendation.
Steve and I met on LinkedIn, and then have done some. And he's a great guy and very very good at organizational theory and that sort of stuff. He took part in trying to help the nation understand a better way of representing itself through the voting process, and we got involved with that. Whether regardless of what side you're on, each vote should count. I don't think anybody seriously would argue that. And that's where we got together and we talked about how to help organizations organize themselves along, if you will, back to the very beginning, along the Apache sort of approach one and having a very democratic organization, which I hesitate because all organizations become hierarchical at some point. And so that's a combination. But how do you a free-flowing organization in an information-rich environment, if we can say it that way, and how do you allow, how do you pass information? How do you pass command of intent? How do you do that and allow the richness of an organization to carry off like that? Steve's very very good at that, and we still communicate. I don't do any social networking except I do watch LinkedIn, which I generally like to do. Sometimes it gets a little weird, but everything gets a little weird.
Well, you delivered one hell of a podcast episode with us today, so we really do appreciate that. So you are now officially on social media.
Yep.
I think you know that.
What happens?
But thanks again for joining us, and we'll keep you on here for a few moments.
All right, good. Well, thank you.